Hello and good morning. We are going to be talking about podcasting and kids' mental health and a journey that began for us in 2014 that took us through writing a book and producing a lovely and high-impact podcast called The Res. There were some comic books scattered on the seats as you came in. They're free merch, take them away, related to our project. I've got some more. If you didn't get one and you really want one, just come and see us afterwards. So we're going to share what we learned about podcasting through a particularly intensive study of it, share what we learned through working with the biggest distributor of kids' audio content in the world, and then we're going to end with a template for successful kids' well-being podcast projects. I'm Martin Spinelli from the University of Sussex. My friend and colleague Lance Dan is from the University of Brighton. Together we are one half of a small children's media company called Resilience Limited.
So Martin and I began work in 2014, which was just after Serial, the podcast, had dropped, and that was when podcasting began to enter people's consciousness and become more mainstream. And we realized that just at that juncture we were in a position to interview all the main players across this sort of new form. So we're kind of very lucky in a unique place. And in the coming years, we talked to people like the presenters of Radio Lab, the producers themselves of Serial, the team behind My Dad Wrote a Porno, the founders of Gimlet, before they sold it to Spotify for too much money and then it folded. Great business sense there. But we kind of pulled all those ideas together, wrote a book, came out in 2019 called Podcasting, the Audio Media Revolution. And now that's the first book in a series we're editing for Bloomsbury Academic. But at the same time as doing all this work, we're very conscious of other issues.
Yeah, so at that moment when we were wrapping up the book in 2018, 2019, we were keenly aware of the worsening children's mental health crisis. And this was something that was affecting us personally, both in our families and with people we knew on this side of the Atlantic and the other. And we started investigating the roots and the intensity of this problem. This graph here that you see shows major depressive episodes among young people more than doubling in a span of 8 years. The Children's Society finds that half of our young people have experienced a significant worsening of their mental health in the past 5 years. The WHO finds that 13% of the diseases 10 to 19-year-olds suffer from globally are now mental health diseases. And obviously the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns exacerbated this problem. The head of the Royal College of Psychiatrists called that situation a crisis on top of a crisis. And as this was going on, Lance and I are both parents, other parents were doing their own research and doing their own homework. And very recently, the Pew Research Center found that 7 out of 10 parents now place at least some of the blame for this worsening children's mental health crisis at the foot of digital devices and the media that their kids consume through them. So after engaging with all this data, after engaging with all this material, we paused and we asked, might there be a better way? Might there be a way to use digital devices and the media that kids get through them in a positive way, or at least in a non-harmful way? And crucially for us, we asked, because that is our background and our professional area of expertise, what might podcasting be able to do to ameliorate in some small way this mental health crisis? So we decided to take some of the things that we learned from working on the book about the traits, specific traits of podcasting, and actually test what they might do for improving the children's mental health situation. So what are some of those traits that we found? First, the key one that really popped out quite early in the research was that podcasting is a uniquely intimate medium. Part of that has to do with the mechanism of delivery. Many people listen to podcasts with earbuds and headphones. The voices of the characters and the presenters are actually manifesting themselves in your ear canal, in your body. And this led, at the time, the top producers of podcasts to address that intimacy and to work with that intimacy and to try and capture that intimacy and use it in their own production practices. And the main way this was taking shape, we noted, was in direct personal address to a single listener in a way that was qualitatively different than was happening on radio before. The second trait following out of the first was that this approach, this direct personal address, fostered parasocial relationships. So parasocial relationships is a sense that the listener has a connection with a presenter or a character. Beyond just being someone like me, it might be that character, that presenter might actually be my friend.
The audience for podcasts is also younger skewing than other forms of audio media. Pew say 50% of the audience is under 30. That's a survey from about 2023. And the audience is really committed. So they're following podcasts in the way that people might have traditionally followed bands, or they follow streamers. So they're buying T-shirts, they're getting merch, they're forming identity around it, they're forming online groups and talking to other people around in communities. Also, podcast listening is very mobile. Edison sort of put it at about 51%, so just over half of listening occurs on the move. So people are listening when they're exercising, on the way to work, in the train. And that you've got to bear that in mind as a producer, because we're coming to this project as producers as well, that the audience isn't paying incredibly close attention to all your material, locked in a darkened room on headphones. They're out and about, integrating listening into their everyday lives, and you have to kind of recognize that you're sliding into their everyday activities like that. But a really important thing for us in our work, what we found, was how often people talked about using podcasts for well-being. So that there are tons of well-being podcasts out there. There's even a well-being category at the British Podcast Awards. So they're using podcasts for companionship. They're feeling lonely, they've got someone like them, there's other people like them, there's that personal voice talking to them. And this is really prevalent with teen audiences. There's a show called Welcome to Night Vale that Martin's modelling the T-shirt of, though he's not a teen. And it's actually a dystopian dark comedy. It's the last thing you'd go to for well-being, you'd think. But teens, we were interviewing, we see them talking online, they find a kind of mental support in it. It's like they're sort of thumbing their nose that's all that's wrong in the world, and sort of getting identity and sort of a sense of assurance from that show.
So after all this, after making all these findings, our first port of call in building a podcast that might actually make a dent in that child mental health crisis is the chap on the screen now, Robin Banerjee. He's the head of psychology at the University of Sussex. He's informally known as the professor of kindness. A lot of his research has to do with kindness, and many of you may be familiar with him. He's done a ton of work for the BBC over the past several years. Last summer, he ran Radio 4's Big Kindness Project. His most well-known research looks at children's media diets, how those diets go on to affect their values, and how those values affect their long-term mental health. Robin finds that what he calls intrinsic media diets, diets that are pointed at self-development, achieving personal potential, health, community, and belonging, are more mentally healthy than what he calls extrinsic media diets. Extrinsic media diets are ones that focus on fame, on social status, on image, and on acquisition of material possessions. So in a nutshell, if you are other-directed, your long-term mental health outcomes as a child are likely to be better. Also, and very appealing to our own work in creating narrative audio over the years, Robin finds that a trait of high well-being teens is empathy. And stories, particularly fiction stories, more than nonfiction stories, help kids develop a sense of empathy. So we took Robin's research and we took what we learned about podcasting, intimacy, parasocial relationships, committed younger audience, mobile media, and we developed this wonderful thing called the RES. RES is sort of futuristic slang for resilience. The RES is a sci-fi adventure drama built for 8 to 11-year-olds that is built on that latest child psych research. It's primarily something that we created using those extrinsic values, those bad extrinsic values that Robin talked about. So we created a world that amplifies and celebrates all of those problematic things. So there's a gamification of every aspect of life. There's relentless competition. You can change your physical body image to keep up with the latest trends every week. Hyperconsumption is rife. Retail therapy is rife. And there's this relentless pursuit of likes and followers. And then we dropped into that world two unlikely friends, our two heroes, who start to scratch the surface of that utopian, dystopian world. And they start to ask why no one is really happy, or is there a better way of doing, a better way of being in the world? We also developed a fun little device in the story, a hacked old phone that allows our heroes to actually talk to the real kids of the 2020s, real kids, contemporary kids that we interviewed about different things. So our heroes in the story dial back into the past and ask kids for advice on how to deal with bullying, on real friendship, on kindness, how to patch things up after a fight, how to make their world better. So we actually hear contemporary kids speaking to our fictional heroes in the story. At this point, it's important to note that we produced the res as a test, a way of testing ideas, a way to see what might work. In the university space that we're familiar with, we call this practice-led research, and we're experimenting to see what has purchase.
So, and in order to get a good data set, to get as much response as possible, we need it to have the biggest impact we can, and we need it to have as much outreach as we could. So to do this, we put together a really nice team of actors led by Emily Burnett from The Dumping Ground and Kyle Queensborough, who was playing Hamilton on the West End at the time. Worked a lot with Nathan Bryan, who spoke here last year. And when the show came out, we passed about 500,000 downloads, which is a good solid number. It puts us in the top 20 drama podcasts and means that we've sort of made some sort of impression. And we got some nice industry recognition. We picked up an ARIA for Best Audio Drama last year, which means we kind of felt we were doing something right. But importantly, with this outreach was our relationship with our American distributors.
Yeah, so Gen Z Media, our distributor, they're the biggest producer and distributor of kids' audio content in the world. They have a partnership with Wondery Kids. They were a very early entrant into the kids' podcasting scene. And that led them to really kind of dominate the space. They produced the two most popular kids podcasts to date, Mars Patel, which came out in 2016, won a Peabody, has popped in and out of the top kids slot for several years. They followed that up with 6 Minutes, an even more popular podcast that was downloaded 30 million times last year. They're very protective of their brand, and in fact, the Res was the first podcast produced outside their company that they included on their distribution platform. Because they have been around so long, because they are very protective of their brand, parents really trust them. Our route to listeners is through parents and is through teachers, and that helped us really reach a lot of listeners and generate a lot of data. It was a huge boost for us. Another thing that we took from working with Gen Z is it really prompted us to pay attention to what was going on the other side of the ocean. So when you compare the Edison research data with the Radar Midas data here in the UK, you find that roughly, in terms of uptake numbers and things like that, we're about 5 years behind where things are in the US, but we're on the same trajectory. So keeping an eye on what's going on there helps us recognize what's going to be popping here in 3 or 4 years. So now, beyond the download numbers and rankings, I want to distill some of our more meaningful message-based findings for you here. So we put together an online survey with 1,000 respondents across our 3 main media forms. So the Res is principally a podcast, 2 seasons, 25 episodes, about 15 minutes each episode. There's also a set of comic books. The first comic, which many of you have in your hands, tracks the first episode of the podcast. The second edition of the comic provides more backstory and fun little vignettes. And the third media form is a games-based website where we have games based on the stories in the episode. There's a Fart Cow Blaster game. There's a Monkey Mayhem game where you get to have a food fight with chimps. And all 3 of these components, these 3 different media forms, shore up and support those pro-social, kindness, well-being, resilience messages that we generated from our site consultants in different ways. So the quantitative data that I'm going to show you on the next slide speaks to how well these messages were absorbed and taken on board by our audience. So our questions about messaging were organized into 4 different metrics: happiness, confidence, connection, and kindness. The infographic here compares the absorption across the different media forms. So users who primarily engaged with the podcasts, users who primarily engaged with the comic, and users who primarily engaged with the website. You can see that the users who primarily engaged with the podcast had the highest increase in their connection matrix. Again, that's the orange bar. So again, those parasocial relationships. The comic book primary users showed the greatest increase in kindness and confidence matrix, and the primary website users showed the greatest gains in the happiness matrix. And the group of bars on the top, if you were a significant engager of all 3 of those media forms, you showed the greatest increase across the board. The key takeaways from the data we had done, just to kind of focus in. So to re-emphasize, audio, as expected and as proven from other historical studies, showed the most potential for fostering a sense of connection. Another finding was that one media form was a route into another media form. So once they found one aspect, they were drawn to another aspect, and that led to the best message absorption. So on that note, we observed that 36% of our respondents engaged with all 3 of our media forms. And again, if they found one media form of the Res, more than a third of them were drawn to the other 2 forms where the impact was the highest.
Which shows us that kids who choose to listen to a kindness podcast respond well to messages of kindness and to podcasting, which feels sort of self-evident. And that's sort of, we refer to that group as our native audience. They're native to podcasting. And being academics, as we're interested in other things. What is the non-native audience? What are kids who are not podcast listeners? How would they respond? And to reach them, we work with schools. So we had the project accredited by the PSHE Association, design lesson plans and packs that people could send off for and ask for. And since October, about 100 schools in the UK and quite a few abroad have signed up to be part of the Res, to use it for teaching. And then very, very recently, we've been going around running workshops, interviewing teachers, and kind of collating this data. And we're still, we did the last one only 2 weeks ago, so it's very fresh. We're sort of still assimilating what we learned from meeting people. But some of the headline takeaways, are that certainly the messages around kindness were landing very, very clearly. Those sort of things were being taken in. Kids didn't really know, in the UK, they didn't really know a lot about podcasting before we talked to us. We found that about 75% of our audience was US and Canadian. And when we went out to schools, only 5% of kids could name another, and we're talking 7 to 11-year-olds, could name another podcast before listening to the Res. When they did listen to the Res, they used it in that kind of mobile second screen way. They carried out other activities, they drew, they played games, and they imagined the story in their head. And the comic book gave them a form of mental scaffolding to build the characters on. They weren't used to listening, so by giving the images, they had something to base that around. The community was strong. They would actually form little res gangs, little groups of kids would get together and like this thing and identify through it. The parasocial relationships were strong. They were drawn to characters like them for all the faults and benefits those characters might have. And one of the things that we were kind of a bit surprised by and found quite entertaining was that this character, Sav's Gran, who's actually not in it tons, and is this kind of kooky inventor, they loved her, and despite all the kind of craziness of the world of the res and all the sci-fi and anything is possible, they found this sort of grounding of this character they could associate with this grandmother figure was coming up again and again and again as the ones they favoured. The teachers themselves are very important to the kids podcasting. GZM, Gen Z Media, use schools and outreach to schools as a fundamental part of their marketing. They try to talk to at least one school across the US per week remotely, and especially through the pandemic, they're doing more and more and more outreach to schools and actually pivoting about 50% of their content towards education. For us, talking to the teachers, they were saying this was brilliant for SEN kids. Kids who wouldn't normally engage with this kind of material were being taken in and engaging with it and thinking about these things. Though some of the more sonically dense moments they found difficult to listen to and showed that maybe we could strip things out. Classroom listening is a really... It was a difficult thing to pull off, so that it's more that intimate personal listening that would really work. So playing stuff in the classroom, even if we gave them videos and things like this, wasn't really hitting home. What really worked was to give them comic books, get them to talk about it, get them to talk about the issues, and then send off as homework listening to the show, and they really responded to that, and they really loved that. So, as I said, all this is very fresh. We're still doing this at the moment. We're pulling in our data, but we have created a little kind of mini template of some ideas and approaches for positive podcasting and for successful use of the form, which we're going to run through now.
So this template, these points are things that Lance and I came up with to help guide our own work going forward. We believe that some of you in here will also find them useful, particularly if you're just taking your first initial forays into the kids podcasting space. So number one is integrate kids' contemporary concerns into your own projects. So talk about their real worlds, their real relationships. Our co-creation workshops helped us do this. On the slide, there's a shot of our co-creation workshop that we did with a theater group in Leicester, but also lean into contact with teachers. They're a great source for issues of the day. Number two, remember that listening is intimate. Again, so think family time, think bedtime. We see this happening in the US market in particular with a lot proliferation of shows speaking to this moment in lives. Number three, for character development, as many of you will know from other media projects, use relationships that they're familiar with, that the kids are familiar with. That is, characters that they associate with from their family, from their friends, from school. That character of Gran is a great example of that. And number four, as GZM reminds us a lot, schools are the route into super high engagement super fans. So produce educational supporting materials, use school connections. GZM are now developing shows that specifically speak to curriculum content, and we're working on one of them with GZM now.
Also, five, talk directly to the audience, foster those parasocial relationships. It's very powerful one-to-one speaking. The sixth one is looking at formats that are clean and simple and can be replicated again and again and again and again, and so that you can build up those relationships over time. Seven is they're very loyal to networks, more so actually than shows. They talk about loving GCM all the time, and because parents trust the networks, they're very important too. And one thing that to bear in mind is that smart speaker listening is going up hugely in the last couple of years. When we first launched 2021, about 10% of our listening was through smart apps. It's now up to about 40 or 50% of listening through smart apps. So shared listening is becoming a thing, and parents are in on the listening experience too. Makes them a potential market, which takes us to our final point.
Yes, point number 8, a bit of a surprise for us, but a very real one. When we're talking about funding kids' podcasts, advertising is probably not the route. Unless you have a huge celebrity attached, it's not really going to work, whether you're talking about funding the project that you're on now or the next one. Frankly, there are much better ways of funding your podcast. So we are pursuing sponsorship relationship arrangements with companies that share our ethos to co-produce material. The res to date has been produced with about £250,000 worth of grant money from different grant sources. Grants are a real source of income. We pay each other through grants. We pay everybody involved with the project through grants. And money in podcasting goes a lot further than it does on screen-based media. You can do a lot more with less. We're looking at building on existing IP out in the world, bringing podcasting to well-known properties that don't yet have a podcast face. So recently, nothing to do with us, Arthur, for example, the Arthur podcast dropped relatively recently. So think about podcasting as a component of larger existing media properties. And we're also taking a page out of GZM's book, and we're looking at optioning our own IP off the back of our large podcast listenership and success. So that is the end of our formal talk. We have a few minutes for any questions.
Hi, I'm Andrew Simpson. I've got a thing called Lammy's Library. I'm really surprised to hear that you're saying kids are listening to podcasts. I have two questions. What age from your research, what age are you finding are kids starting to use podcasts? And it seems like you're saying USA kids, American kids are using them, but British kids aren't. Why is that?
Okay, so first part, kids start listening to podcasts whenever their teachers turn them on to podcasts.
But also bedtime shows as well.
And now at bedtime shows. Now with bedtime shows. And yes, your gloss is right. Things in the States, the young people listening are young people are listening to more podcasts in the States than they are here. Awareness of podcasting as a thing. Often kids and parents still think, oh, that's an audiobook. You're talking about audiobooks, right? Not quite. And yeah, it's going to take a bit more time to get to where things are in the States. So hope that answers your question.
Second question.
We had one back there.
Oh, gosh. Careful.
Hi, my name's Debbie from Hook. I'm just very glad I've discovered the res, I'd never heard of it till today, so this has been very enlightening, so thank you. It's more of a practical question, but how did you do the initial research into the development of the res? I'm just thinking because of the topic and it being for kids.
A lot of work with kids in workshops. So we just workshop with them and just took in what they were concerned about, their issues and how they saw the world. And we've kind of the mentality, we haven't really talked about approach the content was to never work with the world they live in, including their relationship to technology. So any storylines which were sort of chastising them for using technology, we would strike out. And we feel they've been told so often, go out into nature and be part of nature. It's like, let's do a show where one of the characters hates nature and can reflect some of that. So we try not to sort of take that position,
not to browbeat them, but we try to positively reframe. What is a healthy relationship with media? Because neither one of us are naive. We don't think our project is going to get everybody to drop their phones, in spite of what the psych research might say. But there are healthier ways of engaging with social media, and that's what we tried to reframe.
And as David is speaking next, informed us, parents don't see podcasts as being part of screen media. And because it happens in the imagination, and because the kids can interact with the world at the same time. So there can be a real strength to that too. But a lot of it was talking to kids in the dev period.
Hi, I'm Jen Upton, I'm a writer. I've got two questions. What was the target demographic for the res? What is the target demographic?
So we initially started off thinking key stage 2.
Okay.
So roughly 7 to 11. We found over the course of doing this and the feedback that we were getting from Gen Z and our own research indicated that what we'd made was skewing a bit younger. So 7 to 9, I think, is our sweet spot.
Yeah, doing that made me really appreciate what everyone in this room does, knowing how to hit a demographic and stick on the demographic and not accidentally wander to another one. You guys are really good at that. we had to figure that out with our writers.
We learned that.
And then my other question is kind of a more broader one. We all know that there's been a massive increase in diagnosis of mental health issues with children. Is there an element of these, that there are conditions that have always been around, but now they're being identified for what they are, rather than just kids being in the room being depressed for 6 months? Or is there a kind of marked increase?
I'm sure that's true. I'm sure our awareness of the problems that kids are facing and our language for describing it is much more advanced and sophisticated than it was even 10 years ago. So I think there is an element of that in it, yes.
But then the pandemic didn't help. So at the same time, they have just been through that. And, you know, a lot of the themes we deal with were emergent during the pandemic and have a sort of excellent extra resonance because of that.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I've got lots of questions going around in my mind, but so for you, are you coming at this as the point of being academics, trying to explore the world, or are you producers trying to make production content? The only reason why I ask is I'm part academic, part producer, and I find myself getting really interesting territory with projects, but I can only make them work from an academic point of view. They're never going to fly from a kind of a commercial kind of production kind of point of view.
Both. I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, like to an extent, it's rather like we're embedded. Sometimes I feel like I'm in embedded academic in professional circumstances. When I'm having meetings with the Americans, it's like, God, I feel like an academic spy, and they're letting us in on all their kind of industry secrets and jargon and things. And, you know, I've also had, I had meetings with people like, no one from Audible here, but I've had meetings with Audible. I'm like, well, this is going in the book.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of notes.
So you can do both, and you can exist within both worlds. And it's not letting the academia dry out the production is important, and at the same time, being objective when you come to writing up.
Yeah, I just want to chime in as well. So, we got grants to produce the res. We pay everybody living wage rates or their day rate if they're a higher professional. We are both part-time academics. We pay ourselves to work on that project. The project is washing its face, but it's not washing its face through the conventional means of advertising or some other kind of relationship with a paying distributor. And we're going to continue writing grants, and we're going to continue doing stuff, and we are looking at these other options of funding. So it can be done. I think you can straddle the two worlds.
Good question there.
Thank you. Have you found in your research there's a sweet, I mean, we talk about kids, but an 8-year-old is very different from a 12-year-old, cognitively, emotionally, attention, all the rest of it. Is there a sweet spot for listening to this kind of medium? Is it I don't know, the 9 to 10-year-old just at the end of primary school? Is it a slightly more mature kid? Do you tailor, and therefore should you tailor the content
There's
accordingly?
a lot of bedtime stuff. With the charts, we sit there. I mean, like, I do go through the charts and go, bedtime. So they're younger kids. But yeah, and then you find a lot of tween stuff, and once they get into 13, 14, there's more material. So it does feel like there's open space around 7 to 11. Fun Kids are doing it in the UK. People like GZM are doing it in America. But there's a lot of room to discover what it could be. But you do need to tier it to, obviously aim it at them specifically.
Yeah, and I think the res skews a little bit younger than we originally anticipated and originally designed for. And we're in future projects for other people. We're thinking about how to get older teens and doing research into that.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay, I think we're out actually.
That's it.
Thank you so much, everyone.
We're around all
Thank you
week.
a lot.